Have you ever stopped to wonder how secure the documents that define our identity truly are? Imagine a world where the very passports meant to verify who we are could be forged, not by shadowy criminals lurking in the dark corners of society, but by someone who operated openly, supplying these counterfeit documents directly to governments themselves. It's a question no one wants to confront. How could a retired forger sell fake passports on such a grand scale without ever facing arrest? What you're about to discover might surprise you, revealing a hidden flaw in the systems we trust most. This story isn't about dramatic police chases or explosive reveals. It's quieter, more insidious. It's about bureaucracy, about the cracks in the complex machinery of government procurement and identity verification. The forger wasn't a rogue actor working alone in a back alley. Instead, he navigated the labyrinth of official channels, exploiting emergency authorizations and the reliance on third-party verification to deliver documents that passed every single official inspection. These were passports that looked, felt, and scanned as authentic, yet concealed a hidden truth that no one could trace back to him. For years, the operation remained invisible to the public eye. Each sale was wrapped in layers of legitimacy. Contracts signed, intermediaries involved, diplomatic channels utilized. This intricate web ensured that responsibility was fragmented and oversight was nearly impossible. Even when whispers of doubt began to surface, the very structure that allowed these fake documents to flourish acted as a shield. The forged passports were already in circulation, embedded in official systems across borders, legally insulated from prosecution. The authorities found themselves facing an uncomfortable reality. There was no clear criminal violation they could prove. Stay with me until the end because this tale doesn't end with a dramatic arrest or a scandalous trial. Instead, it exposes something far more unsettling, the vulnerability of modern identity systems not to hackers or violent criminals, but to the quiet, methodical exploitation of bureaucracy itself. This is a story about how some of the most serious crimes can leave no one to arrest, no one to hold accountable, and no simple answers. What comes next will take you deeper into the world of this retired forger, the shadowy deals, and the implications for global security. It's in these quiet cracks of the system where the true danger thrives, not in the noise of alarms or flashing red lights, but in the subtle erosion of trust, layer by layer. The retired forger, once a master of crafting false faces and forged documents, now navigates a labyrinth of legal loopholes and administrative indifference. His story reveals a chilling reality. Sometimes the greatest vulnerabilities aren't in the walls you can see, but in the doors left unlocked by complacency and complexity. As we peel back these layers, it becomes clear that the impact ripples far beyond individual cases. Entire institutions, designed to protect and verify, can be manipulated without a trace, leaving victims without recourse and authorities without leads. It's a reminder that security isn't just about technology or force. It's about vigilance, transparency, and the collective will to question what seems routine. If any of this resonates with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe you've encountered moments where the system felt less like a safeguard and more like a maze of confusion and loopholes. What struck you the most in this unfolding story? Sharing your experiences or feelings here not only enriches this conversation but helps build a community that's alert, informed, and ready to challenge the status quo. Every comment shapes the narrative and reminds us that none of this unfolds in isolation. And if you're finding value in diving into these hidden corners of our world, don't hesitate to show some love by liking the video. It's a simple way to keep this dialogue alive and growing. Your support signals that this content matters, encouraging more deep dives into stories that might otherwise remain in the shadows. For those wanting to stay connected, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss what's coming next. It's not just about following a channel. It's about joining a movement of curious minds committed to unveiling truths that affect us all. Your participation here is what fuels this journey, turning a solitary story into a shared quest for understanding. So, if this hits home, drop a line below, hit that like button, and if you're ready to go deeper, subscribe and stay with us. The path ahead holds even more revelations, and together, we'll uncover what lies beneath the surface. Before stepping away from the shadows, the man known for his unparalleled skill in document forgery had spent years navigating a labyrinthine world that few dared to enter. His expertise was not born overnight. It was the result of meticulous study, countless trials, and an intimate understanding of bureaucratic systems that most officials themselves barely grasped. Unlike the typical forger who might rely on crude methods or hastily crafted imitations, his work was precise, almost surgical. Each document he produced could withstand the most rigorous scrutiny. This mastery was the cornerstone of his reputation, giving him access to networks and opportunities inaccessible to ordinary criminals. His journey began in a modest neighborhood, where early encounters with counterfeit papers and false identities piqued his curiosity. Instead of using this knowledge for petty crimes, he invested time in decoding the architecture behind official documents. The inks, watermarks, serial numbers, and security features embedded by government agencies. Over time, he built a mental library of the subtle differences between genuine and forged documents, constantly updating his methods as authorities tightened security. This relentless pursuit of perfection transformed him into a sought-after figure within illicit circles, but also a man who understood the fragility and complexity of identity itself. What set him apart was not only his technical brilliance but also his strategic approach to the underworld. While many forgers operated on the fringes, exposed and vulnerable, he chose a path of cautious engagement. His withdrawal from direct involvement in active forgery was less about stepping back and more about shifting roles. He became a consultant of sorts, someone who could advise on the vulnerabilities of identity systems without physically producing forged documents. This transition elevated his status from a mere criminal to a technical specialist whose knowledge was both feared and respected. In a way, his retirement was a recalibration, allowing him to avoid the immediate dangers of law enforcement while maintaining influence in his domain. Behind this decision lay a complex understanding of risk and reward. Continuing to create forgeries carried increasing risks, not just from police but from rival factions and internal betrayals. By positioning himself as an expert rather than an active forger, he could operate in a gray area that few could penetrate. Government officials, hackers, and even some members of organized crime sought his insight, recognizing that his grasp of document security was unparalleled. This dual existence, part insider, part outsider, allowed him to manipulate systems without ever touching a forged passport or ID in years. His knowledge extended beyond paper and ink. He understood the bureaucratic processes that governed identity issuance, the software used in digital records, and the human errors that often created exploitable gaps. This made him invaluable in a world increasingly moving toward digital verification, where old-school forgery was no longer enough. He anticipated changes in technology and adapted his expertise accordingly, ensuring his relevance long after he ceased manufacturing fake documents. His reputation was thus built on more than skill. It was grounded in an ability to foresee and adapt to a constantly evolving landscape. Despite his withdrawal from direct forgery, he maintained connections with former associates, acting as a silent architect behind various schemes. His role was advisory but crucial, guiding others on how to avoid detection, which vulnerabilities to exploit, and how to create documents that could withstand new forms of verification. These indirect contributions made him a shadow presence, one whose influence extended far beyond personal hands-on work. It was this quiet power that made his retirement significant, marking a shift in how forgery operated within criminal enterprises. His story underscores a paradox: a man deeply embedded in deception who simultaneously became a key figure in understanding and exposing the weaknesses of identity systems. His expertise blurred lines between criminal activity and technical consultancy, complicating efforts to categorize him simply as a forger or a retired specialist. This duality not only protected him but also amplified his importance to various actors. Law enforcement agencies sought him for insight, while criminals relied on his counsel to evade capture. As the world grappled with increasing digitization and tighter security protocols, his unique position highlighted the enduring vulnerabilities in identity management. Though he no longer produced forged documents himself, his knowledge continued to shape the landscape of identity fraud in subtle but profound ways, influencing both the methods of criminals and the strategies of those tasked with stopping them. The man who once operated in the dark now cast a long shadow over the systems he once exploited, his legacy embedded in every forged signature and every compromised identity. His story, however, was far from over. The technical expertise he wielded and the relationships he maintained would soon intersect with new developments, emerging technologies, shifting alliances, and unforeseen challenges that threatened to pull him back into the center of a rapidly changing world. The passport, in its seemingly simple form, represented far more than just a travel document. It was a compact key to a vast network of privileges, protections, and permissions, held together by layers of trust among nations and institutions. This trust wasn't arbitrary. It was meticulously constructed through standardized procedures that ensured each passport's authenticity and the identity of its bearer. Governments depended on this framework to maintain order in an increasingly interconnected world, where the movement of people and capital across borders required a reliable system of verification. At the heart of this system was the passport's ability to confer legitimacy. When a border officer stamps a passport, they aren't merely marking the passage of an individual. They are endorsing that person's legal right to enter, reside, or work within a jurisdiction. This endorsement opens doors to services beyond the immediate scope of travel, access to banking systems, healthcare, voting rights, and even legal protections under a state's jurisdiction. In essence, the passport functioned as a portable badge of citizenship, a document that encapsulated identity, nationality, and entitlement in a form recognized worldwide. This recognition depended heavily on interagency validation, a process where multiple government bodies and international partners cross-checked information to confirm a passport's validity. From the agencies that issue passports to those that verify them at borders and within financial institutions, each link in this chain played a critical role. The standardized formats, biometric data embedded in chips, holograms, watermarks, were designed not just to deter counterfeiters, but to facilitate rapid, reliable verification. This intricate dance of technology and bureaucracy allowed millions to traverse borders daily with relative ease, relying on a shared understanding that the passport represented a verified identity. However, this very complexity also exposed a significant vulnerability. Because a single passport could unlock so many systems, physical, financial, and legal, its forgery or theft had consequences that rippled far beyond the airport gate. Fraudulent documents could grant access to restricted resources and shield criminals behind the facade of legitimate identities. For those who understood the inner workings of the system, manipulating passports became one of the most potent tools in their arsenal. The ability to fabricate or alter a passport didn't just mean crossing borders illegally. It meant infiltrating networks of commerce, finance, and governance. Such crimes were not merely about evading immigration controls, but about exploiting the layered trust that governments and institutions placed in these documents. The ripple effects were profound. Illicit funds could flow through banks under assumed names, criminal enterprises could coordinate across countries with relative anonymity, and individuals could evade law enforcement by disappearing into new identities. This multifaceted impact made document fraud a high-stakes game, where the value of a single forged passport could be immense. The man who once thrived in the shadows knew this better than anyone. His expertise wasn't limited to producing counterfeit documents. He understood the broader ecosystem that depended on passports. He knew how to exploit procedural gaps, leverage weak points in interagency communication, and anticipate technological vulnerabilities. His network extended beyond traditional borders, encompassing insiders who could bypass controls at various checkpoints and corrupt officials who could validate false papers. This combination of technical skill and human manipulation made him a formidable figure, capable of unsettling the very foundations of the passport system. Yet, as governments increased their investment in technology, introducing biometric verification, centralized databases, and real-time cross-border information sharing, the landscape began to shift. These advancements aimed to reinforce the fortress around the passport's integrity, tightening the web of trust that had been exploited for so long. For someone like him, this presented a new set of challenges, forcing adaptations and recalibrations in methods that once worked with relative impunity. Still, the fundamental power of the passport remained unchanged. It was the ultimate tool, a singular document that condensed nationality, identity, and rights into a portable form. Its importance went beyond mere bureaucracy. It was a linchpin in the complex machinery of modern statehood and global interaction. Understanding this dynamic was crucial for anyone operating in the shadows, or in the light, for the coming years would test whether the systems built to protect identity could withstand the pressures of those determined to undermine them. Government procurement processes, typically designed with layers of oversight and rigorous verification, were suddenly transformed by the urgency of external pressures and geopolitical demands. When crises emerge, whether sudden conflicts, health emergencies, or diplomatic standoffs, governments often resort to emergency contracts that bypass standard procedures. These contracts prioritize speed and discretion, allowing third-party vendors to step in and fill critical gaps in supply or services without the usual due diligence. While this approach serves immediate needs, it inadvertently creates an environment where oversight can be fragmented or deprioritized, opening doors for exploitation. In these scenarios, the traditional safeguards that govern identity verification and document issuance become secondary considerations. Agencies tasked with vetting suppliers and contractors find themselves under pressure to approve vendors swiftly, sometimes without extensive background checks. The reliance on intermediaries, outsourcing elements of procurement to external firms or diplomatic agents, adds layers of separation between the government and the actual providers. This distance can obscure accountability and complicate traceability. A skilled forger or a well-organized network can exploit these conditions by positioning themselves as legitimate third-party providers, offering services or goods that appear unremarkable on the surface but serve clandestine purposes beneath. Diplomatic urgency further compounds the situation. When international relations strain under sudden developments, the demand for quick fixes and confidential dealings rises. Governments may agree to contracts negotiated in haste, often under tight secrecy clauses. These agreements can include provisions that limit scrutiny or delay audits, all in the name of maintaining operational security or diplomatic tact. Under such circumstances, even documents as vital as identity credentials might be produced or distributed through unofficial channels, bypassing standard registries and verification mechanisms. The urgency to maintain appearances or fulfill commitments can overshadow the need for thorough validation, inadvertently granting legitimacy to counterfeit or manipulated documents. Moreover, the complexity of global supply chains and the multiplicity of actors involved in procurement create fertile ground for manipulation. Vendors may subcontract portions of their contracts to smaller firms or independent contractors whose backgrounds are less transparent. In the scramble to meet deadlines and contractual obligations, these subcontractors may operate under less stringent oversight. A forged document, once introduced into this chain, can move through multiple hands undetected, ultimately reaching its intended target with apparent official sanction. The sheer volume of transactions and the dispersed nature of oversight make comprehensive verification a daunting task. This environment also blurs the lines between legality and illicit activity. When forged documents are produced within or alongside legitimate government contracts, distinguishing between authorized and unauthorized issuances becomes complicated. Some forgers may operate in legal gray zones, providing documents that technically comply with procurement agreements but serve unauthorized purposes. Others might exploit loopholes in emergency procurement rules that were never designed to handle sophisticated forgery schemes. The ability to move paperwork through official channels, even if only superficially vetted, allows these documents to gain a veneer of authenticity that can evade detection for extended periods. Within government agencies, individuals responsible for approving contracts or overseeing document issuance may lack the specialized expertise needed to identify subtle signs of forgery or manipulation, especially when operating under time constraints. Training and resources are often focused on traditional fraud prevention methods, which may not capture the nuances of modern document fabrication techniques. Consequently, forged credentials can slip through the cracks, particularly when the urgency of the situation discourages prolonged scrutiny. In addition, political considerations sometimes influence procurement decisions, privileging expediency or strategic alliances over transparency. Governments may accept documents or credentials from certain vendors or partners without the typical level of skepticism, especially if these relationships serve broader objectives. This pragmatic approach, while understandable in a diplomatic context, can inadvertently lower barriers that protect against forgery and identity fraud. As these factors converge, the procurement landscape transforms from a system of checks and balances into a complex web where speed, secrecy, and geopolitical necessity often outweigh caution. The vulnerabilities embedded in emergency contracting and outsourced processes provide a practical avenue for those seeking to insert forged documents into official channels, enabling them to operate within legal frameworks while undermining the integrity of identity systems. This dynamic underscores the challenges faced by governments attempting to reconcile the demands of rapid response with the imperatives of security and verification. The implications ripple beyond the immediate context of procurement. Once forged documents gain legitimacy through government channels, their acceptance spreads into other institutions, border controls, financial systems, and law enforcement, creating a cascade effect that complicates detection and enforcement. Tracking the origin of such documents becomes increasingly difficult as they traverse multiple layers of bureaucratic and commercial interaction. The very mechanisms designed to facilitate governance and cooperation become instruments through which deception can be systematically embedded. Understanding these vulnerabilities is essential not only for those attempting to exploit the system but also for those tasked with defending it. The interplay between emergency response imperatives and procedural safeguards presents a persistent challenge, one that demands nuanced approaches capable of addressing the unique risks posed by outsourced and expedited procurement. Without such measures, the balance tilts in favor of those who can navigate the system's cracks with precision and discretion, leveraging legal frameworks to mask illicit activity. In this tangled environment, the distinction between official and counterfeit blurs, and the pathways forged for legitimate government operations become conduits for subversion. The story reveals how institutional urgency and procedural flexibility, intended as strengths in times of crisis, can paradoxically erode the very foundations they aim to protect. The next developments will delve deeper into how these forged documents move beyond procurement channels into broader societal systems, complicating efforts to maintain order and trust. The forger's approach was neither crude nor careless. It was meticulously designed to inhabit a gray area where legality and authenticity diverged. Rather than producing outright fakes that would instantly trigger suspicion, he crafted documents that, on the surface, satisfied every procedural checkpoint. These papers bore all the hallmarks of legitimacy: correct seals, signatures that matched official records, and serial numbers logged in databases. Yet beneath this veneer lay a carefully constructed illusion, one that exploited the system's reliance on form over substance. This method was not about breaking the rules openly but bending them to the breaking point. The forger understood that most institutions prioritize procedural compliance as a shortcut to trustworthiness. If a document scans clean on a machine, if it carries the right stamps, or if it appears in a registry, it's deemed valid. The emphasis on technical correctness rather than origin allowed him to navigate an intricate web of bureaucracy. His forgeries were not cheap reproductions. They were documents that had passed through the same validation processes as genuine ones, effectively blurring the line between real and counterfeit. The key to this strategy lay in leveraging systemic vulnerabilities. The forger injected his creations into official channels, ensuring they appeared in centralized databases alongside authentic entries. This was achieved through intermediaries who had access to internal processes or by exploiting procedural gaps left open by rushed or overloaded staff. The documents, once entered into the system, gained a form of institutional endorsement that no physical inspection could dispute. They became, in effect, legitimate from a procedural standpoint, even if their origin stories were fabricated. This created a paradox. Law enforcement and regulatory agencies, trained to verify documents through prescribed methods, found themselves stymied. The presence of a document in official records was a powerful shield, one that insulated it from immediate challenge. Investigators faced the difficult task of proving not just that a document was false, but that it was false despite passing all legitimate checks. This required digging beyond the surface, tracing back through layers of bureaucracy and personnel to identify where the chain of custody had broken down or been subverted. Moreover, the forger's network extended its influence by ensuring that these technically valid documents circulated widely, embedding themselves within various sectors. Once a forged license or permit was accepted as legitimate, it opened doors that would normally be locked, Business deals proceeded, identities were confirmed, and transactions completed without raising alarms. The ripple effect was substantial, as each document carried a degree of assumed trust that influenced decisions far beyond its initial point of use. This compounding effect made the forgery an insidious threat, undermining institutional integrity without triggering the immediate red flags that traditional counterfeit methods would provoke. The distinction between authenticity and legality became increasingly blurred, challenging the very definitions that underpin regulatory frameworks. The forger's success hinged on this ambiguity, exploiting the system's dependency on procedural validation rather than substantive verification. Authorities found themselves wrestling with a new kind of fraud, one not easily exposed by standard forensic examination or database crosschecks. Instead, the fight moved into the realm of administrative oversight and internal controls, areas often neglected or under-resourced. In this environment, the line between genuine and forged blurred into near invisibility, forcing institutions to confront uncomfortable questions about their reliance on form over function. The forger's work was a stark reminder that legitimacy is not solely a matter of appearance but also of provenance and intent. Yet, proving such nuances within rigid bureaucratic frameworks proved to be a monumental challenge. Each forged document that passed inspection without issue eroded confidence incrementally, making the system itself complicit in perpetuating the deception. This situation exposed a critical vulnerability. When procedural compliance substitutes for thorough verification, the system becomes fertile ground for sophisticated fraud. The forger's method was a masterclass in exploiting this gap, effectively selling legitimacy rather than fake documents. The difference was subtle but profound. It demanded a shift in investigative approaches, moving beyond surface-level checks to uncover the deeper mechanisms that allowed these documents to gain unwarranted acceptance. As the scope of these forged documents expanded, so too did their impact across societal structures. Institutions that depended on the integrity of official paperwork found themselves entangled in a web of uncertainty, where trust was a commodity increasingly difficult to secure. The challenge was no longer simply identifying falsehoods but understanding how a system designed to uphold order could be manipulated to endorse them. This realignment of fraud, from overt imitation to procedural exploitation, signaled a new phase in the battle over institutional credibility. The operation's success in evading detection for such an extended period hinged largely on its intricate design of secrecy and deliberate fragmentation. At its core was a principle of compartmentalization that ensured no single individual or agency held a complete view of the entire scheme. Information was parceled out in carefully measured portions, each segment appearing routine and unremarkable when isolated from the rest. Employees processing transactions saw only the immediate data relevant to their specific task, never the broader context that would reveal the contradictions and patterns pointing to fraud. This division extended beyond personnel to the systems themselves. Databases and records were maintained on separate platforms with no centralized oversight, effectively preventing any automated process from linking disparate pieces of evidence. Plausible deniability was woven throughout the operations framework. Every transaction was crafted to mimic legitimate activity, relying on authentic-looking documentation and procedural norms that, on the surface, conformed to regulatory standards. This deliberate adherence to expected formats and workflows meant that auditors and compliance officers, conducting their routine reviews, found no glaring irregularities. Requests for verification rarely raised alarms, as the forged elements were subtle enough to blend seamlessly with genuine records. The operations architects understood that the best way to avoid scrutiny was not to stand out, but to blend in, making each interaction appear as a natural part of everyday business. The limited knowledge chains played a critical role in maintaining this invisibility. Each participant in the process was given only the information necessary to fulfill their assigned role, with strict controls preventing unnecessary communication between different sectors. This isolation reduced the risk of leaks and inadvertent disclosures, as no one was privy to the full scope or intent of the operation. Even senior managers who oversaw certain divisions remained unaware of the larger network of falsified transactions, as their focus remained narrowly defined by departmental responsibilities. Consequently, when anomalies did arise, they were often attributed to human error or isolated incidents rather than signs of a coordinated scheme. No single agency ever saw the full picture because the oversight mechanisms themselves were fragmented and specialized. Financial regulators monitored compliance within narrow windows, focusing on specific types of documentation or transactions without access to cross-departmental data. Law enforcement units, constrained by jurisdictional boundaries and limited information-sharing protocols, investigated complaints piecemeal, lacking the comprehensive datasets needed to connect related cases. Intelligence-gathering efforts were similarly compartmentalized, with information stored in silos that rarely communicated. This structural division ensured that even when different agencies pursued overlapping leads, they failed to assemble a coherent narrative linking the disparate clues. Moreover, the operation exploited the inherent complexity and volume of legitimate transactions processed daily. The sheer number of records passing through official channels overwhelmed existing verification systems, allowing fraudulent entries to disappear within the noise. Automated controls designed to flag irregularities were calibrated to minimize false positives, which meant subtle deviations slipped through unnoticed. The operations designers carefully tuned their methods to fall just within acceptable thresholds, avoiding the attention of algorithms and human reviewers alike. This carefully engineered invisibility was further reinforced by the operation's adaptability. As detection methods evolved, the scheme adjusted its tactics, modifying documentation styles, altering transaction patterns, and shifting the roles of intermediaries to stay ahead of scrutiny. This dynamic approach prevented static vulnerabilities from developing, ensuring that no consistent signature emerged over time. The operation remained a moving target, its true scale and complexity hidden behind layers of routine processes and plausible transactions. Yet, despite this elaborate veil of secrecy, the gaps and inconsistencies began to accumulate. Isolated irregularities that once appeared insignificant grew into patterns when viewed collectively, though the absence of a centralized system to collate and analyze these signals delayed recognition. The eventual unraveling required a convergence of efforts and the emergence of a more holistic perspective capable of integrating fragmented data streams. Without such a synthesis, the operation was destined to remain a shadowy presence, operating undetected beneath the surface of institutional processes. As the layers of concealment slowly started to thin, the question shifted from how the operation had remained invisible for so long to how the emerging insights could be pieced together to expose the full extent of the deception. As the initial surface calm gave way to a creeping unease within the corridors of power, subtle signals began to ripple through government agencies. What started as routine audits gradually unearthed irregularities that could no longer be dismissed as clerical errors or procedural lapses. Files that had once seemed orderly now presented contradictions. Cross-referencing data revealed discrepancies in timelines and authorized signatures that didn't align with established protocols. These inconsistencies, though seemingly small in isolation, accumulated into a pattern that quietly demanded scrutiny. Behind closed doors, internal reviews commenced, not with the urgency one might expect, but with cautious deliberation. The very notion of reopening settled cases or revisiting finalized documents carried a heavy weight. Acknowledging the possibility of systemic failure was tantamount to admitting that multiple layers of oversight had been bypassed or compromised. Departments that had long prided themselves on stringent verification processes found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about how such an extensive operation could have been orchestrated under their watch. Meanwhile, the tangible consequences of the earlier decisions had already set irreversible events into motion. Identification records had been distributed, names and credentials recorded and disseminated across borders, and individuals who had assumed new identities were now scattered worldwide. The infrastructure built to support this operation had become deeply embedded, complicating any attempt to pull back or dismantle what was, by now, a sprawling network. The reluctance to confront the full scope of the issue was not merely bureaucratic inertia. It stemmed from the intricate entanglement of political interests, institutional reputations, and potential international ramifications. To admit error was to expose vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversaries, undermining the credibility of agencies tasked with national security and intelligence. This created a paradox whereby the very institutions charged with safeguarding integrity found themselves trapped in a web of concealment, each hesitant to be the first to break the silence. Inside a dimly lit conference room, a handful of senior officials convened, poring over reports that meticulously cataloged the anomalies. The mood was subdued, tinged with a mix of frustration and apprehension. Some advocated for a deeper probe, emphasizing that transparency was essential despite the risks. Others argued for containment, fearing that a public revelation would incite panic or diplomatic fallout. The division underscored the complexity of the situation. It was clear that unearthing the full truth would not be a straightforward process. As these debates unfolded, the clock kept ticking. The operation's hidden infrastructure continued to function in the shadows, its agents moving with a quiet efficiency born of necessity. Attempts to trace back the origins of certain documents hit dead ends, as digital footprints had been meticulously erased or rerouted through labyrinthine channels. Each new discovery seemed to open fresh questions rather than offer definitive answers, deepening the sense of entanglement. In the midst of this, a few individuals began to quietly document their findings, compiling dossiers that detailed the discrepancies and the emergent patterns. These records were carefully encrypted and shuffled between trusted hands, an unspoken acknowledgement that the information was too sensitive to be widely disseminated. The goal was less about immediate exposure and more about preserving evidence for a time when the institutional readiness might allow for a comprehensive reckoning. Yet, as the layers peeled back, it became increasingly evident that the operation's success in embedding itself within established procedures had rendered it remarkably resilient. Even as doubts grew internally, the mechanisms that sustained it were far from dismantled. The complexity of disentangling these intertwined systems, comprising forged documents, fabricated identities, and international networks, posed a formidable challenge. It was a puzzle with pieces scattered across continents, each connected by threads of deliberate obfuscation. The tension between uncovering the truth and maintaining the status quo created an atmosphere thick with uncertainty. Officials found themselves navigating a labyrinth where every step risked triggering consequences they were ill-prepared to manage. The initial impulse to act decisively was tempered by the realization that some doors, once opened, could not easily be closed. Despite the weight of these challenges, the undercurrent of inquiry persisted. Quiet conversations in hallways, informal exchanges over coffee, and late-night phone calls revealed a shared recognition that the operation, though hidden, had begun to unravel. The question was no longer if the truth would surface, but when, and what it would mean for those caught in its wake. The tangled web surrounding the forged documents was far more than a simple case of fraud or forgery. As investigators delved deeper, it became apparent that the operation was enmeshed in a labyrinth of jurisdictional ambiguities. The forger's activities spanned multiple countries, each with its own legal systems and enforcement agencies. This fragmentation meant that no single authority could claim unequivocal jurisdiction, creating a legal no-man's land where accountability was elusive. Efforts to coordinate between agencies were hampered not only by bureaucracy but by an underlying reluctance to expose the full extent of the operation's reach. Complicating matters further were the classified contracts linking various government entities to the forger's work. These agreements, often shrouded in secrecy due to national security concerns, effectively cloaked the entire operation in layers of confidentiality. Documents essential to building a prosecutable case were sealed or heavily redacted, rendering investigators unable to access crucial evidence. The classified nature of these contracts introduced a diplomatic sensitivity that discouraged aggressive legal action. Governments were wary of triggering international incidents or exposing vulnerabilities within their own intelligence apparatuses. This diplomatic tightrope was walked carefully by all parties involved. The forger, operating in this gray zone, exploited the very opacity that shielded him. His work was neither fully sanctioned nor openly acknowledged, occupying a shadowy middle ground where formal responsibility was diffuse. Attempts to pin criminal intent on him faced obstacles because his actions were often justified internally as serving broader strategic interests. Without clear evidence of malicious intent, prosecutors found themselves unable to present a compelling case. The line between espionage, covert operations, and outright crime blurred, leaving legal definitions strained and ambiguous. Moreover, the fragmented chain of command within the agencies that had engaged the forger contributed to the confusion. Orders and approvals were passed through multiple layers, often informally, and records were inconsistent or deliberately obscured. This decentralized structure meant that no single individual or office could be held accountable for the decisions that led to the forger's employment and subsequent activities. Investigators encountered walls of silence and denials, occasionally met with veiled threats or hints of repercussions should they push too hard. The atmosphere was one of cautious evasion rather than transparent cooperation. Adding to the complexity was the forger's own skill in maintaining operational security. His movements, contacts, and transactions were meticulously concealed, leaving scant forensic traces. Technological measures, such as encrypted communications and disposable identities, further insulated him from detection. Even when suspicious activities were noted, they were often dismissed or attributed to unrelated causes. The layers of obfuscation were deliberately designed to create plausible deniability, ensuring that any incriminating evidence remained circumstantial at best. Within this tangled framework, law enforcement found itself caught between competing imperatives. On one hand, there was a clear need to uphold the rule of law and bring wrongdoing to light. On the other, there was an implicit understanding that certain operations, while questionable, were entwined with national interests that transcended straightforward legal analysis. The balance tipped toward caution and containment rather than confrontation. Prosecutors and investigators, aware of the broader stakes, often chose pragmatism over pursuit, leading to a tacit acceptance that some truths must remain concealed. These factors combined to create an environment where arresting the forger was not only difficult but arguably impossible without triggering wider consequences. The absence of a definitive suspect, the murky legal terrain, and the classified backdrop collectively formed a shield that no straightforward legal action could penetrate. The operation's exposure, while unsettling, did not translate into judicial resolution. Instead, it exposed the limitations of conventional legal frameworks when confronted with covert operations embedded in international politics and intelligence. As whispers of the forger's identity and the breadth of his activities circulated, the authorities settled into a quiet consensus. Some questions might never be answered fully, and some actors might evade justice indefinitely. Yet, the undercurrents of suspicion and the fragmented pieces of evidence left open the possibility that the story was far from over. The unresolved nature of the case lingered, a persistent shadow that hinted at deeper complexities beneath the surface. After months of careful observation, it became clear that the forger had orchestrated his exit with a precision that left little room for error. The disappearance was not marked by frantic last-minute moves or desperate attempts to cover tracks. Instead, it unfolded as a gradual fading from the radar, a meticulous unwinding of connections and commitments that had once anchored him firmly within the network. Communications with known associates ceased abruptly but without fanfare. Contracts were quietly terminated, and the intermediaries who had facilitated exchanges and deliveries slowly dissolved into obscurity. Each severed link was deliberate, serving to dismantle the infrastructure that could lead back to him. What was striking was the absence of any legal footprint. No lawsuits, no sudden financial freezes, no official complaints that might have forced the forger's hand. Every record of his transactions, once detailed and extensive, seemed to evaporate into thin air. Accounts were drained or closed with methodical care, and paper trails that might have indicated ongoing operations were scrubbed clean, leaving investigators with nothing but gaps and dead ends. The disappearance was less a sudden vanishing act and more a controlled retreat, executed well before any public suspicion began to mount. This strategy suggested foresight and an understanding of how legal and bureaucratic systems function. By the time any red flags appeared in audit reports or financial disclosures, he had already positioned himself far beyond reach. The fabric of his involvement in various deals was woven so tightly that pulling on one thread no longer unraveled the whole tapestry. Instead, each segment was isolated, compartmentalized, and insulated against exposure. The forger's network was designed to survive the loss of a single node without collapsing entirely, ensuring that his absence did not trigger immediate alarms. Intermediaries who once acted as his proxies were either phased out quietly or absorbed into other parts of the operation, their roles either eliminated or shifted to maintain continuity without drawing attention. These individuals, often unaware of the full scope of the scheme, found themselves cut off without explanation. Their communications stopped and their payments ended. The sudden silence from these contacts became another piece of the puzzle, an intentional blackout meant to obscure the trail. Financial institutions involved, knowingly or unknowingly, were left with no suspicious activity to report after a certain point. Transfers slowed, accounts were depleted systematically, and any unusual patterns ceased long before investigators began to scrutinize the transactions closely. This absence of incriminating data further complicated efforts to trace the forger's movements. Even digital footprints, which often betray attempts at concealment, were minimal or non-existent. The use of encrypted channels and disposable devices suggested a level of sophistication that went beyond amateur attempts at evasion. Authorities found themselves grappling with the eerie stillness left behind. No confrontations, no frantic escapes, just a void where a once active presence had thrived. The forger did not flee in panic or disguise. He simply stopped engaging, leaving the scaffolding of his operations to crumble silently. This calculated withdrawal meant that by the time any investigation gained momentum, the trail had long since gone cold. The implications of this methodical disappearance extended beyond the immediate case. It raised questions about the extent of the planning involved and the resources at the forger's disposal. Such an exit could only be achieved through careful coordination, possibly involving trusted collaborators who understood the stakes and the necessity of absolute discretion. The lack of any accidental leaks or slip-ups pointed to a high level of control and a deliberate effort to sever ties without leaving a trace. In the aftermath, the empty spaces where the forger had operated became focal points for speculation. Analysts and investigators alike pondered whether this vanishing act was the final chapter or merely an interlude. The silence, far from signaling closure, seemed to invite further scrutiny. Was there a hidden ledger yet to be discovered? A forgotten account that could unravel the carefully maintained facade? Or had the forger truly vanished, leaving behind a puzzle designed to remain unsolved? As months stretched into years, the absence of new leads became a defining characteristic of the case. Yet, the very neatness of the disappearance, the way it erased legal and financial trails, hinted at an understanding of the system's vulnerabilities. It was not just a story of evasion, but a demonstration of how knowledge and planning could exploit the gaps in oversight. While the forger's presence faded into obscurity, the echoes of his operations continued to ripple through the networks and institutions he had touched. The gradual dismantling of his empire left behind questions about accountability, the limits of detection, and the resilience of illicit structures embedded within legitimate frameworks. In tracing the contours of his exit, investigators encountered more than just absence. They faced the challenge of interpreting silence shaped by design, a void deliberately crafted to outlast suspicion itself. It's unsettling to realize that some of the most damaging crimes don't arise from breaking the rules, but rather from exploiting how well those rules are followed. The systems that should protect us sometimes become the very shields that allow wrongdoing to persist, hidden in plain sight. As we piece together the remnants of this empire's fall, it becomes clear that the silence left behind wasn't just an absence. It was a carefully constructed barrier, designed to outlast scrutiny and keep accountability just out of reach. This case doesn't just end with one man's empire crumbling. It opens a window into a broader reality. How many other operations like this have slipped through the cracks, masked by the very structures meant to prevent them? The challenge isn't just uncovering individual acts of corruption or crime, but recognizing the deeper patterns that allow them to thrive within the system. It's a reminder that vigilance requires more than following obvious clues. It demands questioning the framework itself. If you've made it this far, you've engaged with a story that goes beyond headlines and surface-level investigations. There's value in understanding how complex and intertwined these issues can be, and that understanding is what helps us see the bigger picture. If you found this exploration insightful, consider subscribing to the channel. There's more content that digs into these layers, offering perspectives that bring clarity to complicated realities. And since you stuck with me until the end, drop a comment with "This message was for me." It's a small way to connect, letting me know you're here, thinking along with the story. If this video resonated with you, a like would be appreciated too. It helps keep this conversation alive and shows the connection we've built through the content. There's actually a video right here that ties into what we've just talked about, diving deeper into how institutions can both protect and betray the public trust. Click over and keep going with me. There's still a lot to uncover, and I'm glad you're along for the journey.